I'm speaking with one of my favorite composers, Mr. Henry Jackman, who is one of the busiest composers working today. Henry has quickly become one of the most recognized auteurs in the field and has proven himself one of the most versatile composers around, from Winnie the Pooh, X-Men First Class, Kick-Ass, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, Wreck-It Ralph, Puss in Boots, and more. This year has been extremely busy for him with G.I. Joe Retaliation earlier this year, and now This Is the End, Turbo, and Captain Phillips coming up. Henry's also scoring Captain America, The Winter Soldier. Thanks so much for talking today. Great to chat again.
It's a pleasure. When I hear you list all that stuff, it makes it all seem worth it. It's a very nice introduction.
Well, I'm glad. So we had an amazing in-depth interview last time where we kind of talked about your background and falling into film composing. So we can, I guess, jump right into This Is the End. I love how your projects are so vastly different from one another. What was the approach for this apocalyptic comedy, and what was the key to making the score work?
Well, the clue's right there in the word apocalyptic. What was interesting about This Is the End is it really isn't like the score. If you just heard the music without seeing the film, I think you'd be fairly surprised to discover it's a comedy.
Right, yeah.
Right, because if you just heard the music, it's this sort of grand, symphonic, semi-hysterical, mystical, biblical, sort of grand apocalyptic theme. And you'd be thinking, so no, how's that a comedy? But that was, to me, what was so interesting about the film and why I wanted to do it. Because often, I mean, I'm not knocking, there's all sorts of good music written for comedies, but in general, the comedy genre isn't usually an invitation for a film composer to unleash, the epic forces of a symphony orchestra. It's usually, a different kind of a shtick.
Right.
But because it's a very unique film, it's hilarious for a start. I mean, you've seen the cast, and what's interesting about it is all the, Jonah Hill and Seth and James Franco and all the rest of them, they're all playing themselves, but with this added crazy element that there is, in fact, the rapture has kicked off in Los Angeles rather unexpectedly when Seth was going to get some skins, get some Rizzlers for him and Jay to spend the evening smoking weed, and in the middle of going to get the papers, the world started to end. And what we discovered straight away in talking to Evan and Seth, who directed it, it was fairly obvious fairly quickly that the job of the score, the worst thing the score could do was try to be funny or try to support the guys, the comedy. What it actually needed to do was unleash full symphonic hell and support the rapture and the apocalypse and be completely committed and not pull any punches as if it were some Roland Emmerich disaster film or as if it were I remember referencing when I was first talking to the directors, Jerry Goldsmith's The Omen, which I'm certainly not comparing to because that is an absolutely brilliant score. And in fact, shockingly, I think that's the only Oscar Jerry Goldsmith won, which in itself is completely ridiculous.
I know, that's ridiculous.
He should have got all sorts of Oscars. Anyway, the point being that it was it was sort of a guilty pleasure score, and it's not often if someone said, when I watch things like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you're like, gone are the days when you can unveil a full-blown symphonic, mystical-sounding, semi-apocalyptic, tune in that sort of committed way, and you wouldn't do that, if it were, say, yet another sequel to The Exorcist or something that was more serious, you wouldn't be able to do that. But what's ironic about it being a comedy, the more Carmina Burana stroke Goldsmith Omen, the more I go down that route and the more dramatic and symphonically committed and epic sounding the apocalypse is, the more ridiculous and hilarious Seth and the boys are, and the two are operating like contrapuntionally against each other, and it's not a hat on a hat where I'm trying to be funny in the score, and we found that work really well.
And I noticed that, just my favorite comedies, I love satires and spoofs, and something like Tropic Thunder, where the music has to be serious, or Wrongfully Accused, Naked Gun, like those classics, and that really plays on the comedy. Do you think there's ever a time where music can be funny? Can music ever be funny in a comedy, or does it always have to kind of play a counter to whatever physically is going on screen?
I'm just trying to think. I'm hesitant to say there's any fixed law about these things, and I'm trying to think of cues I've written where I'm encouraged to be amusing, and it does exist, but maybe more in animated films. I mean, there are some cues in. There's some cues in Turbo that have a very deliberate levity, but even then, you should try to keep some symphonic and orchestral pedigree and class to it. There's something about when you really go for broad. If the music ends up sounding like broad comedy, there's something unclassy about that.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah.
And you're right. All those examples you just gave are really perceptive. They're all really good examples of movies that are seriously funny, but that the score is. I'd say another one actually is Ghostbusters.
Right. Oh yeah. Of course.
Ghostbusters is highly entertaining. I mean, Ghostbusters. It's both. A bit like This Is the End. I mean, I remember the moment in the when Sigourney Weaver opens the fridge and some hideous demonic creature is sort of at the back of her fridge, and it's the Elmer Bernstein score. That's all taken totally dead straight. That's a scary moment.
Right.
But then later in the film, you're hearing Ray Parker Jr. and you're hearing, the pop song Ghostbusters, and the two are quite happy living next to each other, and it all works. And This Is the End. It has a bunch of needle drops, and there's some, for the more montage moments, and it's even got the Backstreet Boys in there. So it's got all that, but then just because that's there, it doesn't mean, seconds later you can't transition into a cue that wouldn't be out of place in The Exorcist.
Right. Absolutely. And you mentioned Turbo, which you have coming up also this summer from DreamWorks Animation. You did Puss in Boots and Monsters vs. Aliens for them as well. And you've been doing a lot of animation recently. Is working on an animated film different than live action for a composer? I mean, in terms, not the goals and everything, but like the process. Do you have to adapt to certain things differently?
Yes and no. The ultimate job of being a film composer doesn't change between the two.
Right.
In as much as all films that are decently put together should be a coherent story, and your job is to dissect that story and understand that story and understand the characters and understand the arcs and understand what themes are required and how you can support and enhance that. And that is really no different from a live action to an animation. But there are certain characteristics which, although they're not universally true, they're generally true. Excuse me. For instance, I mean, I would say that in general, the amount of story events and transitions and ideas per minute in animation is always faster. In a live action film, especially if it's a drama or something, you could easily have a 4 or 5 minute scene where two people are having a conversation, and the psychology of the scene and the music would just stay the same. It's like one idea for 4 or 5 minutes. That's very rare in animation. I mean, if you watch any animated film, over the course of a 5-minute section of the film, probably many more things have happened, and scenes have changed, and characters have said things or realized things, or we've cut to different situations. So you have to be more, you've got to be more of a kind of compositional ballerina, kind of dancing your way and twisting on a dime and marking things more regularly. The rate at which things are changing are almost always faster in animation.
And how early in the production process do you come on for animation? Because it spans, it's a much longer process, and they have, the pre-visualizations and the sketches and so when do you really come in?
That's true. I mean, things vary a lot. It's not true always that in live action, the first time you get involved, there's a complete movie. I mean, for instance, with Captain America, I've been reading scripts and revised scripts and way before I'll see anything. But it is true that in animation, necessarily, because they take, say, 4 years to make, you're likely to be introduced to the story and the characters and the ideas, if you're lucky, a long time before the specific task of getting all the cues for the film written. So you can be starting to think about the more general ideas and themes and the characters. I mean, for instance, with Turbo, I met the director, David, in probably, seems like 2 years ago maybe. And I hung out with him, and this was before, I think I saw very little footage. The first day, he basically talked me through the whole film, and there were storyboards and character drawings, and you'd be amazed, because if the story is strong, it's not like you need to get a really good grasp of the tone and the nature and the story of the film.
Mm-hmm.
You don't actually need to see the full feature film. It's amazing what inspiration you can get from, a director who knows what he's doing, who's explaining what's important to him and explaining the story and explaining the characters, and just with a few drawings and some storyboards, you can get a real sense of what a film is. And the advantage of that is you can be thinking about it long before the sort of more onerous task of crafting all the individual cues. That early lead-in time is great for sort of letting the overall idea sort of percolate in your subconscious, so you can be sure you've got the right ingredients and you're coming up with the themes that are, once you do deconstruct these themes and use them all over the film, you've had long enough to make sure the initial material, the basic thematic ideas, are the right ones that will suit the film.
Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. In your projects, they differ so much in tone and emotions, and you've been kind of jumping all around the genre map. How do you get into the right emotional state of mind for a score when you write? Do you have any routines or methods that get you and your mind in a certain emotional state, or is the project and story at hand usually enough to get you going?
If I was going to be flippant, I'd say it's the fear of the deadline. But that's a very negative way of looking at the world. I mean, there's some of that. Some of that is that, you can't stare at your navel for 4 years and pontificate about life and the universe, because, the movie's got to come out. And if the movie's going to come out and you're doing the music, guess what? You've got to nail the music. So some of it is the beneficial effect of a particularly big film having a schedule that, can't necessarily be broken from. But from the more creative side, I mean, the movies that I choose to do are usually because, the phone call come and I'll go and hang out and look at it and get a feel for it. And what tends to happen for the ones you want to do is you think about it, or you look at it, or you read a script, or you're seeing storyboards, and it's sort of doing something for you. You're looking at it and you just instinctively go, yep, okay, so I understand this, I get the creative driving force behind this, and it's coherent, and you start to just naturally have ideas about it, and it in a funny way, your job is made easier. The more a director's vision is coherent, the more it's leaving the right kind of vacuum for you to step in and occupy that space and not be confused. It was like that with Turbos, but same with Wreck-It Ralph. I remember early days of Wreck-It Ralph, I didn't see that much footage. I got the full lowdown of the film, and it just made sense. It just made sense, and you feel like you're not too far away from having the ideas that will make a contribution to it. And so some of that, it really is, if a director's got hold of a story that works, then it really does. You would think that irregardless of that, you should be able to come up with good music for anything, but it really does make a huge difference if something coheres before you even get involved. Then it's not just that you can be inspired by it, it's that as you start to work on it, it has an internal sense to it, because all of the mechanics of the story have been thought out, and there's a logic that then starts to come through in the music you're writing, because if you're pegging yourself to a creative endeavor that's been conceived by someone, and if it's been conceived coherently, then the beneficial effect of that starts to flow through in what you're doing as a composer.
Oh, that makes absolute perfect sense to me. And you're working with an amazing director and auteur, Paul Greengrass, with Captain Phillips, which is coming out later this year. He's one of my favorites. And he's worked with John Powell on his past films, and they definitely had an amazing collaboration. And now you're stepping in. How is it working with Paul for the first time and starting a new, collaborative effort? Was your sonic style a good match to his visual style?
Well, it's what's interesting about Paul Greengrass is, and I'm talking about jumping around genres, it really is another completely different direction, because the fascinating thing about Paul Greengrass as versus, I don't know, even live action, like a superhero movie like X-Men or Captain America, mm-hmm. and definitely a million miles from animation, is it's almost the absolute reverse of, because Paul Greengrass is style is so I mean, he has a journalistic background.
Yeah.
And he's very politically aware, and he's just a thoughtful human being. So a movie like Captain Phillips absolutely isn't going to be, heroic American manning the ship as he's, unjustly assailed by baddie Somalis who should all be shot in the head and or sent to jail. It's an incredibly morally ambiguous and psychologically credible film that completely comes out of his interest and his background. I mean, he used to be a journalist. I mean, if you just look at his films, United to 93, actually even Bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
Bloody Sunday is a borderline. I mean, it's a movie, but it's borderline documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And now the impact of that on musical style is that you have to repress some. Well, repress is probably a pejorative word, but you have to develop a style in which many of the devices that you would ordinarily use in storytelling, in music, themes and different harmonizations of the orchestra and like leading an audience are completely out the window. It's a completely different style where, if anything, you have to sort of cultivate a sort of aesthetic invisibility, because with when you've got those kind of psychologically credible performances from actors like Tom Hanks, and in fact a lot of the actors are unknowns or real people who really do work on the Alabama, or these shipping, these guys who work on the boat. I mean, it's the same in United 93. The air traffic controller who appears in that is actually an air traffic controller.
Right. Yeah.
Right, so once you get into that kind of filmmaking, nothing could be more destructive than some sort of like big symphonic classical theme that will just step all over that type of aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the discipline of learning how much territory musically you can cover with the simplest imaginable elements. And sometimes it's just textural. And how much you could, like, if it were a painting, it'd be much closer to a Mondrian than a Caravaggio. Like, you can't, it's not narrative, it's not even figurative, it's shapes and colors and textures to achieve and enhance, it's just sort of, it's like writing music that gets the correct psychology of music across without any of the invasive elements of theme and some of the more manipulative aspects of film score. And that is just a completely different discipline. And it just goes to show how different things are required, for different movies. Like a Paul Greengrass film, as anyone who knows Paul Greengrass films knows that, if you put Bloody Sunday up against Jurassic Park, they're both films, but I mean, they just couldn't be more diametrically opposed. And and that's his aesthetic. So, it's not the time to think, oh yes, Harry Potter, great, we can unleash florid orchestration and endless themes. It's the reverse challenge of seeing how much can be made from the simplest and most effective textural building blocks, and without ever invading some of the jaw-stopping acting performances that just feel as real as you are likely to see in a film.
And I can't wait for it. I mean, when I saw your name on there too, I was like, oh, this is going to be extremely interesting to see. I mean, United 93 and Green Zone are so intense and visceral, and I think it's going to be a match made in heaven for you too. I know Captain America is still far, far away, and it's Marvel, so I'm sure they're listening right now, making sure you don't say anything. But can you talk about what you want to do for the sequel? Are you expanding upon the first one, or are you kind of creating a new starting point?
No, it's a new starting point, not because I'm some natural anarchist or anything. The movie, I've read, I've got the scripts, and I've received a few, and then they're working away and doing a few revisions and whatnot. But the headline is very much, I mean, because the first Captain America was a sort of period piece, and had I don't know how you would describe it. It's a morally uncomplicated baddie, as it were.
Right, yeah.
and was very much in the tradition of early Captain America. I mean, if you read the original comics, Captain America literally comes across as straight up American governmental propaganda. If you ever get hold of it, like the first three, if you just read the first series of Captain America, he is an unquestioning beacon, excuse me, of in fact, what was the phrase? A sentinel of liberty, and he marches around the place bashing up Nazis, making sure that everyone understands that communism is bad, including even like lecturing small children as to the pitfalls of communism and how to spot a communist and report them to your mum and dad. And, it's like full on almost, we're always tempted to think that propaganda only happens in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, but actually in a slightly more gentle form, Captain America really was full on patriotic propaganda. But what's interesting about the history of Captain America within the comics is as events unfolded in over time, and America had more challenging situations like Vietnam, and America became a sort of more self-questioning place than it might have been, say, in the 40s or 50s, in the 70s. It's totally reflected in Captain America. I'm sure someone's going to write some sort of thesis, or they easily could do, to demonstrate the correlation between the sort of national psyche of the United States of America and the sort of political internal struggles, and how that ended up being reflected in that comic book. Because what's interesting is it becomes a lot more morally ambiguous. Because the challenge you got with films like that, I mean, when you have things like Star Wars, it's very easy because until you realize Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father, it's very simple to have an out-and-out baddie because it's fantasy, and the stormtroopers, you don't worry about their parents every time they get shot, or the life insurance that may or may not have to be paid. And Indiana Jones had the genius move of making sure the baddies were Nazis, because I think, you'd have to be a madman not to agree that the Nazis need to be dispatched. But in modern filmmaking, what's a little more challenging is it's quite difficult to create a political or narrative landscape where it's very obvious who's standing up for values we can all believe in and who is definitely to be extinguished and dispatched, because a combination of how the media works and people maybe being a bit more informed with more sources of understanding what's going on in the world. The truth is, in the real world, it's not that common to have a completely black and white situation as to what is corrupt and what is evil and what is I think everyone can agree there are certain things going on in the world that we don't want to see, and there are certain values we'd love to see, especially if you come from Europe or America. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about this the new Captain America is he's now a fish out of water in a completely contemporary society. And, the origin of Captain America is a superhero who can unquestioningly believe that the American government is a beacon of democracy and freedom that can be spread without fear of contradiction across the world, correcting the ills of other evil and hideous regimes. Now, of course, if you've done Captain America in like 2013, it's a more politically confused landscape, and that comes through in the story. He's at odds with the society he lives in. He's at odds with some of the things he's being asked to do. He's more questioning. There's a whole backstory, which I can't give too much away, that is emotionally haunting him. So there are many more aspects which make it more psychologically explorative and darker and more morally ambiguous. All of which I guess the quickest way to say that is it's a more contemporary look at it, because we're taking an icon of patriotic superhero status from an era when that seemed very uncomplicated, and superimposing it on a political and emotional landscape that is a lot more challenging, and seeing how the two, smash together.
This will be the second time you're actually filling in for, in Alan Silvestri's footsteps. Your score for G.I. Joe and, now Captain America. Is it daunting, or do you not even think about following in somebody's footsteps like that?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I hope he bears me no ill will, because he's actually a hero and an influence for me, anyway. we may have spoken about this before, but when I was at school, when I was about 14, I was in a very strict English boarding school. I was, in the midst of studying, doing all my classical music studies and listening to Brahms and Wagner and Mahler and playing Debussy and Bach and all this kind of thing. I remember sneaking out of my room because us little juniors had decided we were going to go and steal the VHS player from the senior boys' room downstairs and watch Predator and hopefully not get caught. And so we did that, and we were super excited that we had Predator on VHS, and we put it in, because it was an 18 film, so we weren't even supposed to be watching it. And halfway through the film, as well as enjoying this weird infrared-looking alien who was busy picking off people one by one in the middle of the jungle, I was like, wait a minute, this music is massively harmonically sophisticated and is in the same category as concert music, the kind of music I'm studying at school, because in my ignorance, I don't know. Obviously everyone knows that Star Wars is brilliant and John Williams, but that's almost in its own category. I was caught off guard thinking I was just going to watch Predator with my friends, and then I was like, wait a minute, something else is going on here, which is some really interesting tritone harmonies, and this is some serious. Normally when I listen to music, I can just track all the harmony and dictate it all in one go. And I was like, wait, hold on a minute. You're going to have to rewind. Because there's some voodoo going on in here that needs further investigation. And I remember when the movie finished, the other guys were quick, we got to take the VHS and sneak it back and get back to our rooms before we get caught. And I was like, wait, no, hold on, let the credits go, because I got to see who did the music. And I remember seeing this name come out, Alan Silvestri. I was like, man, I got to remember that guy, because that was in the same class as some of the classical music I'm studying. And he's done so many good scores, all the Back to the Future scores. What about Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Brilliant, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, he's just non-stop class, Alan Silvestri. So I'm sure he's perfectly happy doing whatever his next project is, in luxuriating on his vineyard in Santa Barbara, probably thinking, let that young idiot, I simply can't be bothered to get involved in the second G.I. Joe film. Let this young monkey have a go at it. But no, you're right. Here's the way to look at it from my point of view that makes me sort of pinch myself is when I tell that story. So there I was at 15 years old, watching that VHS, thinking, maybe one day I might be lucky enough to be allowed to even get involved in doing music for movies. And now I find myself being allowed to score films that people of the caliber of Silvestri have been involved in, only a few years previously. So from that perspective, I'm certainly, it certainly makes me feel humble about it, because in my mind, it's incontestable that those guys are in a different league. As far as I'm concerned, Alan Silvestri is a legend.
No, that's a great story. That's awesome. Well, to wrap up, last time we talked, I usually ask composers if you could score any film ever made, with no disrespect to the original composer, which film would you pick? You said Harry Potter, but this time let's twist it. And since you've been genre jumping a lot lately, so far in your career, what have you found to be your favorite genre to write music in?
That's so difficult. You know what it is? It was so difficult. Is the grass is always greener on the other side. If I said something that was, more symphonic, or maybe in the animation category, so you can really indulge, or a fantasy film like Harry Potter or Spiderwick Chronicles or something like that, so you can indulge all your orchestral symphonic chops that are rooted in the Western symphonic tradition, then I'd probably start getting all miserable that I'm not doing loads of production and electronic stuff. But then if I pick something that's full on production and not so much symphonic, I'd probably then start going, no, I wish I was doing more symphonic stuff. So I don't know. I think if I said Harry Potter last time, I'd tell you a film that, with absolutely no disrespect to the genius who worked on it, it would have been truly brilliant to have been involved in Ridley Scott's first Alien film.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because it would, if you did it now. I mean, the Goldsmith score actually is very thematic and has a serious degree of symphonic class to it. I mean, you could put together an orchestral suite from Alien and play it in the Walt Disney Concert Hall and stand it up alongside 20th century music, concert music, and it would not be, there would be not a million, there wouldn't be like a crack between the two. It's of the highest class. But I guess if you were to do Alien now, you'd be able to combine some really posh, maybe minimal symphonic writing with some really cool textual stuff. So I guess that would be a really, imagine the original Alien had never been made, and there was never Alien or Aliens, all those other ones, and there'd never been that franchise, and it started, now, and there was Alien was made in 2013, but it was as classy as that first film. That really would be such a, being Ridley Scott, it's got all that, it's got the tension and it's got the sci-fi, but it's also got an unparalleled degree of class to it as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is difficult with sci-fi. Often, people sometimes unfairly associate sci-fi with a little bit of goofiness.
Right.
But that certainly isn't the case. I mean, that first Alien film it's a winner.
Well, that's a great answer. Well, Henry, thank you so much for your time. Chatting with you is always absolutely fun and informative and amazing. So I really appreciate your time and I'm currently enjoying all your work. So keep it up, and I can't wait for everything that's to come.
No problem. No, it's been great. But no, it's always a pleasure. Give me a call when you want to hear me spout on about music. I'll happily do it anytime.